Can you provide for the record a copy of the recusal agreement that you signed when you were at the New York Fed?
I did not sign a recusal agreement. I withdrew from day-to-day management operations policy issues of the New York Fed, and my colleagues, both in Washington and in New York, can attest to that.
So there was no formal agreement?
No, as I said in my testimony, what I did is I withdrew from, and this was very important to do. Again, no precedent for this, a sitting president of the New York Fed being nominated to be Secretary of the Treasury. And I withdrew from, after carefully consulting my colleagues, from involvement in monetary policy decisions. I did not go to the FOMC meeting in December, and I withdrew from all decisions about these individual cases involving the financial system and from day-to-day management. And that was the right thing to do at that time.
Thank you for clarifying that. Number two, a lot of people think that the president of the New York Fed works for the U.S. government. But in fact, you work for the private banks that elected you.
No, that is not true.
Can you provide, for the record, the names of the handful of bankers on the board of the New York Fed that elected you in 2003, please?
That is a matter of public record.
2003?
Of course we can do that.
Thank you very much.
But, Congresswoman, can I just say, what you just said was not true. I work in the public interest. Officials of the Federal Reserve work for the public interest, and they work for the government.
But the people don't elect you. The heads of the Feds around the country don't elect you. It's the individuals who sit on the board of the New York Fed that elect you. Is that correct?
It's slightly more complicated than that. What the Congress did in setting up the Fed is set up a system where the presidents of the regional reserve banks are elected by their board, but it requires the approval of the chairman of the Board of Governors in Washington for them to serve. So it is a delicate balance of checks and balances, and Congress designed that system.
But it is largely private banks that elected you, and I would like you to provide that for the record, please.
Oh, absolutely. That's a matter of public record.
The Cleveland Fed is not equal to the New York Fed, so I'm very interested in your answer to the record. Number three, Goldman Sachs was the largest domestic recipient of funds in this AIG counterparty arrangement. Let me ask you, now as Treasury Secretary, your Chief of Staff is the gatekeeper for access to you. Could you please provide his name?
His name is Mark Patterson.
Thank you. And for whom did he work before you selected him as your Chief of Staff?
He worked for the President's transition team.
No, before that. Which Wall Street firm did he work for?
Before that, again, this is a matter of public record, and you know the answer to this question. He worked for Goldman Sachs. But
thank you very much.
Patterson,
you answered my question, Mr. Secretary. Now let me say this. The AIG transaction, you have answered the question. You've answered the question. Thank you. The AIG transaction was disturbing to many observers. Why did our government not require the bank creditors to take the lead and bear some of the cost in any plan to stabilize AIG? You, in effect, nationalized the company and let the bank creditors off the hook. Why did you, as president of the New York Fed, not work out an arrangement to remove the London unit from the company rather than allowing the unit to infect the entire company?
If we had had the types of bankruptcy procedures we have for banks, it is possible that ultimately we could have done that. And if it would have been easy and cheaper for the taxpayer for us to separate the riskiest parts of the firm from the healthy, profitable insurance companies, we would do that. And in fact, that is the core of the restructuring strategy the company is now undertaking. But that choice was not available to us at the time. If it had been possible, of course we would have done that. But because we did not have the tools that we have under bankruptcy, we did not have that choice.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Your phone logs from the subpoenaed material this committee requested, which I would like to insert in the record, show between September 14th and November 26th. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The critical period when the bailout occurred, and just after September 15th, when the three major rating agencies downgraded AIG's credit rating, you made hundreds of calls, and the most, over 225, to Secretary Paulson, who was then Secretary of Treasury. What firm did he work for prior to his appointment as Secretary of Treasury?
He worked for Goldman Sachs.
He worked for Goldman Sachs. Now, Goldman Sachs, as I understand it, got the most in counterparty payments of any domestic institution. Is that true, $14 billion? I
actually don't know if it's that true, but that's a matter of public record.
Societe Generale got the most from an international firm, but Goldman Sachs was number one. Now, you made about 100 calls to Federal Chair, Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, but then the next highest number of calls in that period, you made 103 to a man named Dan Jester. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll end. May I just ask, what firm did he work for?
He worked, as you know, he worked for Goldman Sachs.
Thank you, and I will have additional questions with regard to who you phoned, and we will place that in the record. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just say one thing in response to this? I just want to say it's very important. Congressman, you were suggesting that the people that were involved in this were not acting in the public interest, and you were suggesting that they were working for the private interest, not the public interest. And that is not true. I would never, and I believe none of those individuals would be ever part of any decision like that. And I think these people were people of enormous integrity and experience operating under exceptional circumstances with no precedent, doing the best they could for what was in the public interest. And I think it's important to say for the record.
I must move.
Congressman, I think I understand your concern, and I believe I share its fundamental premise. That if we are going to be successful in creating a more stable system, we have to make sure that we address and reduce the moral hazard risk produced by the interventions of this crisis.
Mr. Secretary, even before we create a new system, I'm talking about today, literally today. Can you tell people who are buying derivatives today that they can't look to the taxpayer for any kind of bailout should the issuing party be unable to?
Again, Congressman, let me just start with your premise. A principal source of losses to the core of the financial system came from institutions like the monolines that are relatively small institutions. Nobody thought they were big to fail, and they received no assistance from the governments, writing protection well in excess of their capital requirements. So I don't think I believe in the basic premise of your question, although I share your concern.
Mr. Secretary, I'm not asking for philosophy here, whether you agree with me on the premise. I'm asking a very simple statement. Is it at least theoretically possible that a derivative issued today will be subject to a bailout tomorrow?
Congressman, I just don't think that it's, there is an enormously complicated set of legal conventions around the diversity of financial products in our markets. And I don't think that question, as you phrased it, I can respond to it.
Let me ask the question a different way.
Okay.
Do you want to use this opportunity to tell the financial markets that there is no bailout or a possibility, or do you want to use this opportunity to tell our constituents that derivatives being sold today might result in the bailouts payments of tomorrow?
Congressman, what I want to use this opportunity to do is to lay the case for why we need comprehensive oversight and regulation of the participants in the derivatives markets and those instruments.
Mr. Secretary, I can understand why you'd prefer to answer somebody else's question. I get 4 minutes. It's a very simple thing.
You can ask it different ways if you want, but what you're asking
I want a yes or no answer.
No, I'm not going to answer it that way, because what you're asking me to do is to give an irresponsible answer to a complicated set of legal questions around enormous financial, and I'm not going to add to
what you're basically saying is that you think it would be irresponsible to tell people that derivatives issued today are not possibly going to get a bailout.
No, I'm not prepared to answer that question that way as it was framed, but I'll be happy to talk to you about this at any length you like and try to make sure we come to a better understanding about the legal complexity.
I look forward to those discussions. Thank you.
This could very well be the early phase of a hyperinflationary bubble. So
okay, well, why are they fighting? Because Geithner reportedly screaming at them, cussing, saying, you've got to get behind me and the president's policies, and then they're saying, look out for inflation. So is that what the internal fight is over, or what's your intel on that, Webster?
I think this is it's just a quarrel among thieves. In other words, there are all kinds of frictions there. There is the question of the regulatory role of the Federal Reserve, believe it or not, where Bernanke does not want to do certain things that Geithner wants him to do. The egos get involved. I don't think this is a huge matter, but the Federal Reserve has actually come under heavy attack for the strong-arming of Bank of America on the absorption of Merrill Lynch and a few other issues. So there's a lot of bad blood against the Fed in Congress on these sort of secondary issues. Of course, that can then be parlayed into the nationalization of the Fed, which is what I would recommend. So you've also got to remember that Geithner is an unstable little thug, right? He's a foul-mouthed character, right? He's
yeah,
from
the Wall Street Journal.
School.
The Wall Street Journal and the Street are reporting that it was all these top regulators, SEC chairman Ben Bernanke, and that he was screaming and yelling, almost like Hitler, just going completely wild, frothing. And it said that this, seemed to shake up a bit Bernanke, the former boss of Geithner. So this looks like all is not well in Camelot, as this air of invincibility, this Mount Olympus godlikeness of these bankers evaporates. I think they're feeling the heat with the End the Fed movement or the Audit the Fed movement.
Well, I think they've also got very severe international problems. In other words, Geithner had to spend the first part of the week kowtowing to the Chinese, who are his bosses. So he had to lick the boots of the visiting delegation from Beijing and assure them that he was responsible after all.